In the winter of 2015, a 29-year-old traveler from California named Emily Warner arrived near Denali National Park carrying excitement, hope, and an unguarded faith in someone she barely knew. Only days later, that faith nearly cost her life. 5 days after she vanished into the frozen wilderness, park rangers discovered her barely alive, stripped of clothing, bound to a tree in one of the park's most inaccessible regions. Her body was ravaged by frostbite and wounds, and her mind bore the imprint of a journey that had transformed from a long-awaited mountain dream into a brutal fight to stay alive after an unthinkable crime. Emily was raised in San Diego in a stable, middle-class household. Her parents, both educators, encouraged independence, curiosity, and a respect for the natural world. That upbringing shaped her path. She earned a university degree in environmental science and devoted her early career to working with a conservation organization, believing deeply in protecting the land she loved. Travel was not a phase for Emily, it was a calling. She was drawn especially to remote, sparsely populated places where nature still felt untouched. By her late 20s, she had explored numerous national parks across the United States, completed multiple treks, and acquired basic outdoor survival skills. Those who knew her described her as warm and open-hearted, sometimes to a fault. She believed people were fundamentally good. In January 2015, she decided to realize a long-held ambition, to experience Alaska in winter and trek near Denali, a place she viewed as both majestic and humbling. Her plan was careful. She booked a 2-week trip scheduled for early to mid-February with an organized trekking group. But just days before departure, the company canceled the expedition due to a lack of participants. Emily had already arranged leave from work, purchased flights, and invested in cold-weather gear. Rather than abandon the journey, she chose to continue on her own. Her new plan was flexible. She would travel solo, stay near Anchorage, look for potential companions, and make shorter trips into the surrounding wilderness. On February 7, 2015, she landed in Anchorage and checked into a small hostel in the city center, a place known for drawing hikers and adventurers seeking partners for remote excursions. The hostel's common room was a crossroads of stories and maps, where travelers compared routes and formed temporary alliances. It was there, on the evening of February 8, that Emily met a man who introduced himself as Brandon Killigan. He was 36, solidly built, with a trimmed beard and the confident posture of someone accustomed to rough terrain. Brandon spoke easily of Alaska. He claimed to have lived there for 5 years, working seasonal jobs in oil fields and spending his free time hunting, fishing, and trekking through the backcountry. He discussed winter conditions, survival tactics, and regional trails with practiced certainty. His knowledge seemed authentic, and Emily found herself reassured by his calm authority. When Emily mentioned that her group trek had been canceled and that she was hoping to find someone to hike with, Brandon immediately offered to accompany her. He described a 5-day route through isolated land west of Denali, an area rarely visited, where Alaska's wilderness remained raw and undisturbed. He told her he knew the terrain well and had proper equipment, even a satellite phone for emergencies. Doubt surfaced. Venturing deep into the mountains with someone she had just met was undeniably dangerous. Yet Brandon's composed demeanor, his fluency about the land, and his vivid descriptions of Alaska's beauty slowly eroded her hesitation. Other hostel guests were either committed to different plans or preparing to leave. In the end, Emily chose trust. They agreed to depart on the morning of February 10. Brandon said he would collect her in his vehicle, drive to a remote trailhead, and leave the car near the forest's edge before continuing on foot. The plan involved 4 nights in tents and a return to the vehicle on the 5th day. The day before departure, Emily prepared carefully. She purchased extra supplies, double-checked her gear, and emailed her parents to let them know she would be hiking for 5 days with a companion she met at the hostel. Following standard safety advice, she left a copy of their intended route at the front desk. The hostel administrator recorded Brandon Killigan's name, phone number, and the expected return date of February 15. Early on February 10, Brandon arrived in an old, dark blue Ford Bronco. They loaded their packs and drove north, then west, leaving paved roads behind for dirt tracks that cut into the wilderness. During the drive, Brandon spoke constantly, pointing out landmarks, mentioning wildlife they might see, suggesting ideal places for photographs. Emily felt at ease. Her confidence in him deepened. After roughly 3 hours, they turned onto a narrow forest road leading to a deserted parking area at the edge of a vast, silent forest. No other cars were there. Brandon remarked that winter solitude was part of Alaska's true beauty. They unloaded their gear, locked the vehicle, and he tucked the keys beneath a wheel, explaining it as a precaution. Then they set off on foot. The first day passed quietly. They followed a snow-laden trail that wound through dense forest before gradually rising into the mountains. The temperature hovered around -15 degrees Celsius, sharp but calm. Snow crackled beneath their boots, the air clean and biting. Brandon pointed out animal tracks, hares, foxes, signs of moose, guiding Emily deeper into a landscape that felt ancient, indifferent, and vast. They paused often along the trail, pouring steaming tea from a thermos, tearing open energy bars, letting their breath settle before moving on. As dusk approached, they reached a narrow clearing. Brandon said it would be a good place for their first night. He set up his tent, Emily pitched hers a short distance away, and he built a fire from gathered wood. Dinner was simple, dehydrated meals and canned food warmed over the flames. They sat in the firelight, talking about journeys taken and lives lived. Brandon spoke at length about his exploits across Alaska. Some of his stories sounded exaggerated, almost unreal, yet Emily accepted them without question. When darkness fully arrived, the cold sharpened, and they retreated into their tents. The night passed without incident. The following day unfolded calmly as well. They climbed higher, eventually reaching a ridge that opened onto vast valleys and white-capped peaks stretching endlessly into the distance. Emily stopped often to take photographs, overwhelmed by the quiet beauty. Brandon appeared considerate, taking some of her gear when the ascent became difficult. By evening, they settled into a second campsite tucked into a hollow sheltered from the wind. Again there was fire, food, and conversation, but something beneath the surface had shifted. Brandon sat closer than before. His movements lingered. When he handed her a mug of tea, his fingers brushed her hand again and again. He commented on her looks, called her brave, intriguing. Emily felt uneasy. She answered politely, careful not to provoke him, subtly creating space where she could. When she said she was exhausted and wanted to sleep, Brandon suggested she share his tent because it was warmer. Emily declined, explaining that her own shelter was fine. He didn't press the issue, but his expression changed. The warmth drained from his eyes, replaced by something rigid and cold. The third morning carried a tension that hadn't been there before. Brandon barely spoke. He walked ahead quickly, never turning back, never suggesting rest. Emily struggled to keep pace, sensing that control had quietly shifted. By midday, they reached a stretch of the route where the trail was nearly erased by deep snow. The wilderness felt absolute, no tracks, no sound, no sign of anyone for miles. When Emily asked to stop for lunch, Brandon spun around sharply and told her they would keep going, on his terms, not hers. His voice carried an edge that made her heart race. Trying to steady herself, Emily said they could turn back if he no longer wanted to hike together. Brandon laughed, but it was harsh, almost mocking. He said they weren't going anywhere until he decided otherwise. In that moment, Emily understood the truth. She was isolated, far from help, without communication, and the only person with her had become a danger. That evening, Brandon chose a campsite buried deep within dense forest, far removed from any open ground. Panic rose in Emily's chest, but she forced herself to remain composed. She helped with the tents and the fire, hoping calm behavior might diffuse whatever had changed inside him, hoping survival still lay in cooperation. After dinner, once darkness closed in, Brandon moved suddenly. He seized her arm and told her he liked her, that she should appreciate what he had brought her to see. Emily fought back instinctively, tearing herself free and running into the trees. He caught her almost immediately. She fell hard into the snow as he tackled her. She fought with everything she had, scratching, screaming, but the forest absorbed the sound. Brandon struck her across the face, commanding silence. What followed dissolved into terror. He dragged her back to the camp, bound her wrists and ankles with rope from his pack, ignoring her cries and pleas. He raped her, unmoved by her resistance, by her pain, by her terror. Time lost meaning. When it ended, Emily lay motionless in the snow, injured, stunned, barely aware of her body. Brandon sat by the fire, detached, smoking, watching the flames as though nothing had occurred. Eventually, he looked at her and told her that if she ever spoke of what happened, he would find her and kill her. He said no one would believe her anyway, she had chosen to come with him. Emily said nothing. She lay there, trying to survive the shock and the agony flooding her body. The night was unbearable. He left her bound, tossed a sleeping bag over her, but her clothes were soaked from sweat and snow. The temperature plunged to -20. She shook uncontrollably, teeth chattering, unable to sleep, while Brandon rested in his tent undisturbed. At dawn on the fourth day, he finally cut the ropes. He told her they would continue moving. And if she tried to escape, if she made a single wrong move, he would kill her and leave her in the wilderness, where no one would ever find her. Emily was in no condition to fight back. Fear and exhaustion hollowed her strength. She lifted her pack and walked behind him, step after step, without a word. The entire day passed in silence. More than once, the thought of escape flickered through her mind, but she knew the truth. Injured, traumatized, without a map or GPS, fleeing into this frozen terrain would almost certainly mean death. By the evening of the fourth day, they entered an even deeper stretch of wilderness. The snow lay untouched. Even animal tracks were rare here. Brandon chose a campsite and ordered Emily to sit against a tree. He bound her wrists behind her back, looping the rope tightly around the trunk. Then, without hesitation, he began stripping away her clothing, her jacket, her sweater, her thermal layers. Emily screamed. She begged him to stop. She told him she would freeze. Brandon showed no reaction. He removed everything, leaving her completely naked in the open cold. He said she deserved it, for resisting, for failing to be grateful. He assaulted her again as she was tied to the tree, striking her whenever she tried to fight. When it was over, he gathered her clothes, shoved them into his backpack, and told her he was leaving. If she was still alive by morning, he said, maybe he would return. Emily cried uncontrollably. She pleaded with him not to abandon her, telling him she would die. Brandon only smiled. He said that was her problem. Then he walked away, taking both backpacks, all the food, tents, and equipment with him. Emily was left alone. She was bound to a tree, naked, in temperatures near -22 degrees Celsius. She pulled desperately at the rope, but the knots held firm. Her fingers were already losing feeling. She screamed for help until her throat burned, but the forest answered with silence. Darkness thickened around her, swallowing sound and time. Hypothermia came quickly. First, violent shivering seized her body. Her teeth slammed together so hard she feared they would crack. Then the shaking weakened. She knew what that meant. From her survival training, she understood that when shivering fades, the body is failing. Her fingers and toes went numb. Her skin darkened, purple, then blue. The cold pushed inward, sinking into her chest and abdomen, slowing her heartbeat. The night stretched endlessly. She drifted in and out of consciousness. She dreamed of her parents, of warmth, of her home in San Diego, sunlight on sand. Each time she woke, reality returned: snow, trees, darkness, pain, cold. More than once, she believed she was dying. She prayed that it would happen quickly, that the suffering would end. Then, sometime before dawn on the fifth day, she heard sounds. At first, she thought it was her mind breaking, footsteps, distant voices. But the noise grew clearer. She tried to call out. Only a weak, hoarse sound came. She forced herself to try again, drawing on whatever strength remained. The voices came closer. Lantern light cut through the darkness. Figures emerged, park rangers. A ranger patrol was moving through the area, conducting routine winter checks on trails and wildlife, something they did periodically even in the most isolated regions. The team was led by Senior Ranger David Wilson, 42 years old, a veteran with 2 decades of experience in Alaska's wilderness. As they followed their route, one ranger noticed something unnatural ahead, a dark shape near a tree that did not move. When they approached, they saw Emily. She was naked, bound, rimmed with frost, her skin blue, her breathing barely visible. Later, David Wilson would say that in all his years on the job, he had witnessed many horrors, but this was among the worst. They acted immediately. An emergency call went out over the radio with their coordinates. A medical helicopter was requested. The rangers cut the ropes, freed Emily, wrapped her in jackets and sleeping bags, and built a fire. She was conscious but unable to speak, releasing only faint sounds of pain. They gave her warm liquids and carefully massaged her limbs, restoring circulation slowly, knowing that rapid warming could be fatal in severe hypothermia. One ranger with medical training examined her injuries: extensive bruising, abrasions, clear signs of assault, and second- and third-degree frostbite on her fingers, toes, and face. She was alive, but just barely. The helicopter reached them roughly 40 minutes later. Emily was airlifted to a hospital in Anchorage, losing consciousness during the flight. Upon arrival, she was rushed into intensive care. The diagnosis was grave: advanced hypothermia, severe frostbite to her extremities, multiple physical injuries, dehydration, exhaustion, and clear evidence of sexual assault. For several days, doctors fought to keep her alive. The damage was extensive. Necrosis had already set in, and surgeons were forced to amputate the fingers of her left hand and 3 toes on her right foot. Still, she survived. When Emily finally regained awareness and could speak, she told investigators everything, every detail of the man who called himself Brandon Killigan, the route they had taken, and the place where he had left the vehicle. Police moved immediately. In the abandoned parking area where the hike had begun, they found a Ford Bronco. The vehicle was unlocked. Inside were Emily's belongings, clothing, documents, equipment, silent confirmation of her account. A search for Brandon Killigan was launched at once. Records showed he held an Alaska driver's license, was registered as a resident, and had no apparent criminal history. That story unraveled quickly. Further investigation revealed that Brandon Killigan was an alias. His real name was Greg Thomas Martin, a man already wanted in Washington state for sexual assault and attempted murder committed 3 years earlier. He had disappeared and resurfaced in Alaska under a false identity. A nationwide manhunt followed. Martin's photograph was distributed across Alaska and neighboring states. Rangers, police units, and volunteer teams searched relentlessly, checking cabins, remote camps, and forest outposts. Yet weeks passed with no trace of him. Then months. Authorities began to suspect that he had either perished in the wilderness or escaped under yet another name. Emily remained hospitalized for 2 months. Her physical injuries slowly stabilized, but the deeper damage was invisible. She was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. Nightmares haunted her sleep. Panic attacks struck without warning. Darkness terrified her. She struggled to be near men. Psychologists worked with her every day, but healing came slowly and painfully. Her parents flew to Alaska as soon as they learned what had happened. They carried heavy guilt for not stopping her, even though they knew the decision had been hers. When Emily was finally discharged, they brought her back to San Diego. She never returned to Alaska. In June 2015, for months after the crime, a hunter in a remote area near the Alaska-Canada border discovered a body in the woods. The remains were partially decomposed, but clothing and documents identified the man as Greg Thomas Martin, also known as Brandon Killigan. A forensic examination concluded that he had died from hypothermia and exhaustion approximately 2 weeks after attacking Emily. Investigators believed he had become lost, depleted his supplies, failed to find his way out, and frozen to death. It was a harsh symmetry. He died by the same cold he had used as a weapon. Yet for Emily, the news brought no peace. She later told therapists that she wanted him alive, tried, convicted, and imprisoned. Death in the wilderness was not justice. The case was officially closed after posthumous identification of the perpetrator. Prosecutors filed a formal indictment against Greg Thomas Martin on charges of kidnapping, sexual assault, attempted murder, and unlawful imprisonment. Emily gave sworn testimony despite the absence of a trial. Her statement became part of the permanent record, a voice preserved even without a courtroom. Emily Warner's story soon became public. Media outlets published dozens of articles about the tourist who survived an Alaska nightmare. A photograph taken before her trip, smiling, hopeful, was placed beside images of frozen mountains under headlines describing a dream transformed into horror. For a long time, Emily refused interviews. But a year later, she agreed to speak on a program focused on survivors of violence. She said she wanted her experience to serve as a warning. "I trusted him because he seemed normal," she said. "Experienced. Reliable. I thought I could read people. I was wrong. The most frightening part is that they look like everyone else. They laugh, they help you carry your backpack. And only when you read completely alone with them, far from help, do they reveal who they truly are." Her message was clear. Never travel into remote places with strangers, no matter how safe they appear. Always leave a detailed plan. Carry reliable communication. And never mistake confidence for character. I lived only because of chance, Emily later said. The rangers were there at that exact place, at that exact moment. Without them, I would have died tied to that tree. The park rangers who found her were later honored by the National Park Administration for bravery. David Wilson dismissed the praise, saying they had simply done their duty, yet he admitted the experience reshaped his understanding of danger. In the wilderness, he said, it is often not animals that pose the greatest threat, but people. Recovery did not come quickly. It took years. Emily endured long-term therapy, relied on antidepressants, and attended support groups for survivors of violence. Slowly, step by step, she learned how to exist again in the world. Complete healing was never possible. She left her work in environmental conservation, unable to face wilderness without fear. The landscapes she once loved had become shadows of trauma. Instead, she chose a different path. Emily began volunteering with organizations that support victims of sexual violence, offering guidance, empathy, and presence to women navigating their own aftermaths. Her body adapted to loss, prosthetics replaced missing fingers, and daily routines were relearned, but the deeper scars were not visible. They lived in memory, in instinct, in the quiet moments. She still fears winter. The cold unsettles her. Total darkness keeps her awake. Forested places tighten her chest with unease. Emily Warner's story stands as a stark reminder: danger does not always rise from nature itself. Often, it wears a human face. Alaska is unforgiving, a land where small errors can be fatal, but sometimes the most devastating mistake is placing trust in the wrong person. Emily once imagined mountains as symbols of freedom and wonder. What she found instead was a trauma that will never fully release its grip. And no amount of planning can remove all risk. People like Greg Martin exist, individuals who know how to mirror normalcy, borrow credibility, and cloak violence in confidence. The only defense is awareness. Listening to intuition. Remembering that trust is not something given freely, but something proven over time, through consistency, through boundaries, through truth, not through charm or convincing stories. Emily survived. That is what matters most. She walked through hell and returned altered, incomplete, yet alive. Her story is not only one of victimhood, but of endurance. Of someone who carried unbearable darkness and still chose to live, to help others, to speak. It is a reminder that nightmares can hide beneath the promise of adventure, and that true strength is not the absence of fear, but the will to survive it and continue forward.